Reverend Ahmondra, and I'm coming to you today with the third video in our series, Get Stronger to Live Longer, the strategy called HALT. Today we are going to be focusing on lonely. Although I grew up as an only child and I spent many hours by myself alone, I never experienced loneliness. And I didn't experience loneliness because I was connected. I was connected to my mom. I was connected to my community. There was connection. And that connection prevented me from being lonely. Many times we think that if we're by ourselves, we're lonely. No. Loneliness is a disconnection to our spiritual self, our spiritual being. I had a childhood friend that I met when I was 6 years old, and we were inseparable until 21 years old when she was murdered. I did not begin to experience loneliness until that connection with her was broken. And see, it wasn't that she was gone away and wasn't in my space. She was no longer connected to me spiritually. When I'm talking about lonely, I'm talking about that spiritual disconnect. We can be in a crowd full of people and feel lonely, or we could be in our house by ourselves and not feel lonely. When you begin to look at loneliness, the question that you can ask yourself is, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I belong in my family, in my community? Do I feel like I belong in my skin? Because for many years, I felt like, the water's coming in, the water's coming in. For many years, I did not feel like I belonged in my skin. I was that detached. And as a result, I started putting substances in my body so that I would get rid of that feeling of being detached, feeling by myself. Loneliness has nothing to do with our physical location to something. It has to do with our spiritual connection. I remember I spent many years working diligently in the church, and I was lonely because I didn't have a spiritual connection to the other members in the church. It had nothing to do with them. It had nothing to do with the activities. It had to do with me. It had to do with me having deep-seated grief, deep-seated pain, which broke my connection to others. And when I started to actually recognize and heal the deep-seated grief that I had inside, this shell that I had put around me to protect me from hurt and pain started to dissolve. And as it dissolved, I began to build connection. And when I started to build those connections, I stopped feeling lonely. So today, I ask you the question, do you feel like you belong? And if you don't, do you feel lonely? And when are the times that you feel the most lonely? One way to test that out, see how you're feeling when you're with a group of people. See how you're feeling when you're by yourself. If you want to pick up something to put in your mouth, either a drink, some food, or anything, any behavior, when you're starting that feeling of loneliness come over you, it's time to take a look at that. I know people that have been married 20 years, 30 years, feel alone, totally alone, because the connection that they had when they first got together was broken and it never was put back together, or a new connect was never made. I lived 10 years in a marriage where I felt disconnected, and that is where my addiction to drugs and alcohol really took off. I did not understand that I was in a space where I was disconnected spiritually, and that disconnection had its root in the grief that I was experiencing from the death of my good friend. As a minister, I talk to individuals all the time who are alone and suffering in silence, particularly Black women. And when we look at their lives, they look like they are the most happiest, connected individuals around, but they're not. They're lonely and they're suffering. Loneliness right now in our country is the number one affliction for many individuals. So take a look in your life. I'm running because the water's coming. See if you actually need to do some work around those feelings that you may be suppressed. You might be experiencing deep grief, and that grief has morphed into isolation, and that isolation has caused loneliness and disconnection. Is it time to begin to heal so that you can build connections again? Loneliness is not a place that we want to live. In my work as a social worker, I was responsible for newborn babies whose mothers couldn't take care of them. And before I would place those newborn babies in foster care, I would spend time with them in the hospital. I would go up and I would sit and I would hold them and I would talk to them because they did not bond with their mom. And they needed to understand and have that human touch, that human connection. Because if they didn't, their little spirit would never connect and they would live in a world darkened by loneliness. Many, many years ago, when they had orphanages, way before our time, and they had like babies just in cribs, and they would feed them and they would change it, but nobody would touch them, nobody would talk to them. Those babies perished. It's called the failure to thrive syndrome. So sometimes we have to go all the way back to our childhood to look and see when we had a break in belonging. Did that break in belonging occur when you were a little tiny, tiny person and you grew up feeling like you weren't attached, you didn't belong, regardless of how big your family was? Those babies that I sat with in that hospital had to understand and know that they were loved, that they were connected. And so it was my responsibility to make sure that before they left that hospital and went to their new home, that they had a sense of connection, that they did not have this feeling of loneliness crop up in their little teeny weeny soul. So looking at loneliness is very, very important because in our society, we don't look at loneliness. We think that if we fill our lives up with stuff, if we're doing things, if we buy things, if we are engaged with doing things with people, that we're okay. But not necessarily so. Many of the people who are living what I call Facebook lives are lonely people. They have so much posted on social media about how great things are. But in reality, they feel alone. And there's no place for them to say, I feel alone. I do not feel like I'm connected. I'm living in a space of total, complete loneliness. I'm hoping that this channel can provide a space for our truths to come through. So we can say, I don't feel like I belong. I feel like I'm lonely. If you go to my website, ucqueen.com, you will see that I have a community. It's called the Original Queen Sacred Community. It's a safe space for us to join together in sisterhood and create connection so that we can break the cycle of loneliness or so that we can help others break the cycle of loneliness. So if you're not experiencing loneliness, I still invite you to join us because you can help another sister who may be experiencing loneliness. Loneliness is that behavior, that feeling that leads many of us to not want to be here any longer. It leads to isolation, and isolation can actually lead to suicidal thoughts. So today, please make sure that if you are experiencing loneliness, that you share that feeling with someone. And if you don't have a community that you feel comfortable with, I invite you to join Original Queen. Go to my website, ucqueen.com, and you'll see the link where you can join. Don't be lonely, my sisters. My purpose on this planet is to make sure that we all understand and realize we are divine beings. And as divine beings, we are spiritually connected. It's only when we allow the circumstances in our lives to impact us that that connection can be broken. If you haven't picked up my book, please do. The Uncrowned Queen Reclaims Her Throne. When a Black woman breaks the silence, you will hear my story about how long I lived feeling lonely and isolated and what it did to me. You will also see how I came out of it. And be sure to pick up the journal so that every day you can write 5 things that you appreciate about yourself. Thank you for joining me today, and don't be lonely. Blessings.